What's the worst part about being a quadruplet? I was one of four. My sisters Octavia, Marigold, and Cordelia and I were quadruplets. Identical, except Marigold. The worst part about being a quadruplet isn't being mistaken for each other. The worst part is that one of you knows something the other three don't, and you spend your whole life trying to figure out which one. Growing up, our parents treated us as a unit. Same clothes, same schools, same activities. But Marigold was always slightly outside. The one with a different hair texture. The one whose blood type, we found out at 14 at a Red Cross drive, didn't match the other three's. Our mother had an explanation. Fertility treatments. Multiple embryos. One can be different. It happens. We believed her. The four of us were still inseparable. In our late 20s, Cordelia decided to do a commercial DNA test. For fun, the rest of us joined in. 4 tests, 4 envelopes, sent the same day. The results came back in waves. Octavia, Cordelia, and I matched as identical sisters. Marigold didn't match us at all. Not as a sister, not as a half-sister, not as a cousin. Marigold wasn't related to us. We confronted our mother. Our mother cried. She told us the truth she'd been carrying for 29 years, that we 3 were her biological daughters, triplets, that Marigold arrived the same week we did, that the fertility clinic our parents had been using had a situation with another patient, that another patient at the clinic had died in childbirth, alone, with no family, that her baby survived, that the clinic had a problem, no family, no paperwork ready, a newborn with nowhere to go, that the clinic asked our parents, who'd just delivered triplets, if they'd be willing to informally take a 4th baby home the same day, that the paperwork would follow, that no one had to know, that our parents said yes, that for 29 years, Marigold didn't know she had a different mother, that the paperwork was never actually followed up, that Marigold existed in our family without an actual adoption order, just a birth certificate the clinic had quietly forged. That's why we were raised as quadruplets, to cover the lie. Marigold didn't cry when she heard it. Marigold was calm in the way someone is calm when something they've always known finally has a name. The 4 of us spent the next year being closer than we'd ever been. Even though the words for what we were had changed, we helped Marigold try to find her biological family. The clinic was long closed, but a former nurse named Henrietta was still alive and willing to talk, off the record, in exchange for our promise not to bring her into anything. Henrietta told Marigold her biological mother's first name, the name of the small town the mother had come from, that her biological mother had been 20 years old, alone, scared, and trying to disappear from somewhere when she came in to deliver, that there was a man the mother was afraid of, that the mother had been hiding under a different name at the clinic. Henrietta gave Marigold the real name, Luna. Marigold found, through that name, a grave, in a county 200 miles away. The grave belonged to a young woman who'd been missing for 29 years according to that town's small newspaper archive. Who was the daughter of a family who'd been searching for her for the same 29 years? Marigold reached out to that family, gently, with proof. The family embraced her. But here's the thing. When Marigold's biological grandmother Sheba finally met her in person, the grandmother told her one thing the 4 of us weren't ready for. That Marigold's biological mother hadn't died in childbirth from natural causes. That the autopsy report, which Sheba had been keeping in a file for 29 years, showed she'd been poisoned by someone who'd visited her at that clinic the night she gave birth, whose name, on the visitor log, Sheba had kept too. Sheba sat us down, all 4 of us, in her small living room with a folder on her lap that looked like it had been opened and closed 1,000 times. She pulled out a single page, a copy of a visitor log from the clinic, yellowed at the edges. She pointed to one line, a man's name, written in neat handwriting. Next to the reason column, it said, family friend. None of us recognized it. Marigold didn't even look. She just sat there with her hands in her lap, very still. Sheba tapped the page with her finger and said, she had no family friends. She was hiding. She came to that clinic under a fake name because she was running from someone. Whoever this man was, he found her. The way she said it made my skin go cold. I asked Sheba what she knew about this man. I asked if she'd tried to find him. She looked at me and said, I spent years trying to trace that name. Years. I hired people. I called every phone number I could find. Dead ends. All of it. The clinic closed 3 years after your mother died. Everyone scattered. Nobody wanted to talk about that place. I could hear in her voice how tired she was. The kind of tired that comes from 29 years of looking for answers and getting nothing. I thought about Henrietta. We had something Sheba didn't. We had already spoken to Henrietta. She might speak to us again. I pulled out my phone. My sisters watched me. I found Henrietta's number and I hit dial. It rang 4 times before she picked up. Her voice was guarded. I told her I was sorry to bother her again. She was quiet for a second. Then she said, I told you girls everything I could. I don't want to be part of this. I told her I respected that, but I said there was one thing I needed to ask her. Just one thing. I read her the name from the visitor log. The full name. Exactly as it was written. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that tells you everything before anyone says a word. Then Henrietta said, very quietly, where did you get that? I told her about Sheba, about the autopsy, about the poisoning. I could hear her breathing change. Then she said, that name. I saw that man once. He came in late after visiting hours. The front desk let him through because he said he was there for a consultation, but he went straight to her room. She paused. I didn't think anything of it until the next morning when they told us she was gone. The room around me had gone completely still. Sheba was gripping the arm of her chair. Octavia had her hand over her mouth. Marigold still hadn't moved. I asked Henrietta if she could describe the man. She gave me a vague description, but then she said something that made me feel like the floor dropped out. She said, he came back 2 days later. Not for her. He came back to talk to the doctor running the clinic, and then he left with your parents. I said, what do you mean he left with our parents? My voice didn't sound like my voice anymore. Henrietta said, I mean I saw him walk out of the building with your mother and father. They were carrying the babies. All 4 of them. I looked at my sisters. Marigold finally looked up. She looked right at me, and her voice was steady but so quiet I almost didn't hear her. She said, are you saying my parents knew the person who killed my mother? She wasn't asking me. She was asking Henrietta. I held the phone out a little so she could hear. Henrietta said, I'm saying they left the building together. That's all I know. And then she hung up. The click of that call ending was one of the loudest sounds I've ever heard. None of us moved. Sheba was looking at Marigold with the look of someone who had always suspected something like this. The clinic didn't just ask our parents to take a baby. There was a man involved. A man who visited a scared, hiding woman the night she was poisoned. I said, we can't jump to conclusions. We need to talk to mom and dad before we decide what this means. Octavia looked at me like I had just said the most naive thing she'd ever heard. She said, what conclusion am I supposed to jump to? A man visits a woman the night she's poisoned, and 2 days later he's walking out with mom and dad and the baby? What does that sound like to you? I didn't have an answer. Marigold said almost nothing during all of this. She sat with her arms folded across her chest, her body pulled in tight like she was trying to take up as little space as possible. I asked her if she was okay. She looked at me for a long time. Then she said, I've spent my whole life feeling like something was off, like I was loved, but loved as a project. I need to know if the people who raised me had something to do with why I don't have a mother. That sentence hit me harder than anything Henrietta had said. I made a decision that I thought was the right one. I decided I would go to our parents' house alone. I wouldn't bring Octavia, who was angry. I wouldn't bring Cordelia, who was scared. I wouldn't bring Marigold, who was the one person with the most right to be there. I told myself I was being smart. What I was really doing was trying to control the situation. That was my mistake. I drove to my parents' house the next morning. Braylon was in the other room watching TV. Lyra was at the kitchen table with a cup of tea that had gone cold. She looked tired. The kind of tired where you can tell someone hasn't been sleeping. I started gentle. I said, Mom, when you took Marigold home from the clinic, did you know anyone else who was involved? Lyra's hands tightened around her cup. She said, the clinic handled everything. We just said yes. I pushed a little more. Her eyes started filling with tears and she looked down and said, why are you asking me this now? I could have kept going gently, but I had been carrying the weight of what Henrietta told us, and I couldn't hold it anymore. I pulled out my phone. I opened the photo I'd taken of the visitor log page. I turned the screen toward Lyra and set it on the table between us. She looked at it, and then she went still. Not just quiet, still. She stared at that name on the screen for what felt like a full minute. Then she said very quietly, where did you get this? I told her everything. About Sheba, about the autopsy report. I said, Luna was poisoned, Mom, the night she gave birth. Someone visited her that night and she was dead by the morning. Lyra started crying. The kind that comes from somewhere deep, somewhere old, like a door she'd been leaning against for years had finally been pushed open. She said, I didn't know she was poisoned. I swear to you, I did not know that. I watched her face. I believed her. But that wasn't the only question. I said, but you know this name, don't you? She nodded. Just this small, slow movement of her head, and I felt my stomach go tight because that nod meant everything I was afraid of was real. This wasn't a stranger. I opened my mouth to ask the next question, but before I could get a word out, Braylon walked into the kitchen. He stood in the doorway and his eyes went from Lyra's face to my phone on the table. He said, what's going on? Lyra looked up at him. Her face was red and wet and she looked at him in a way I had never seen my mother look at my father before. She said, they found out about him. The way she said him told me everything. She didn't need to explain who. Braylon already knew. His face changed. It was like watching a door close. He looked at me and his voice got hard. He said, who told you to go digging into this? I said, Marigold's grandmother. Luna was poisoned, Dad. The woman whose baby you took home was murdered. Braylon didn't flinch. He said, we didn't take anyone. We were asked. We said yes. That's all we did. He said it like he had said it before. I said, then who is the man on this visitor log who walked out of that clinic with you? Braylon looked at the phone. He looked at Lyra. He looked at me. And then he said, that's none of your business. My own father looked me in the eye and told me that a murdered woman was none of my business. I stood up. I picked up my phone. Lyra reached for my hand and said, please, just wait. But I pulled away. I walked out of that kitchen and out the front door, and I sat in my car in their driveway for 5 minutes before I could even see straight enough to drive. I called Cordelia and Octavia as soon as I could hold my phone steady enough to dial. I put them on a group call. I told them everything. When I repeated those words, that's none of your business, I could hear Octavia's breathing change. Cordelia's voice came through next. She said, we need to go back together. All 4 of us. I agreed. Going alone had been my mistake. While we were talking, Marigold had been quiet. That was Marigold. When things got big, she got small. But quiet didn't mean she wasn't doing anything. Marigold said she'd been looking into the name on the visitor log on her own. She found something. Her voice was calm when she said it, but the kind of calm that's holding something heavy underneath. She said, I found something. The name on that log. It's not a stranger. It matches a relative. On Dad's side. When she said that, everything in my body went cold. I said, what do you mean? Marigold said, I mean the man who visited my mother the night she died has the same last name as Braylon's mother's maiden name. It's a family connection. I had to pull my car over. I told Cordelia and Octavia I would call them back. Then I called Lyra directly. She picked up on the second ring. I didn't ease into it. I said, Mom, I need you to tell me the truth. Is the man on the visitor log related to Dad? The pause that came after was the kind of pause where you can feel the other person deciding something. Lyra let it fall. She said, he was your father's cousin. He worked at the clinic, not as a doctor. He handled logistics, billing, paperwork. I closed my eyes. The man who signed into that clinic the night Luna was poisoned was not a stranger. He was family. I said, did Dad know he visited Luna? Lyra said, I don't know what your father knew. I've been asking myself that for 29 years. That sentence told me more than any confession could have. My mother had been living with this doubt for my entire life. I asked the hardest question I have ever asked anyone. I said, Mom, did Dad's cousin arrange for us to get Marigold? Was that the plan all along? Lyra started sobbing. She said, I don't know. Your father told me the clinic approached us, but his cousin was the one who walked us through the paperwork. His cousin was the one who made the birth certificate. His cousin was the one who told us it would all be handled quietly. And I was so tired. I had 3 newborns, and I didn't ask the questions I should have asked. I sat there listening to my mother cry, and I thought about all the times she looked at Marigold with something in her eyes that I could never name, something that looked like love, but also looked like guilt, the weight of not knowing. I called my sisters back. I told them everything. The 4 of us sat together that evening at my apartment. Nobody sat far apart. Octavia spoke first. She had her elbows on her knees, and she was looking at the floor. She said, so Dad's cousin worked at the clinic. He visited a woman who was alone and hiding. She died that night. And then that same cousin helped our parents take her baby. And no one ever reported any of it. Nobody argued. Marigold finally cried. Not loud. Tears running down her face, slow and steady. She said, I need to hear him say it. I need to sit across from Braylon and hear him tell me what he knew. She called him Braylon, not Dad, and none of us corrected her. We decided to go that night, all four of us, together. We got in my car. Marigold sat in the front seat. The drive was about 40 minutes. For the last 10 minutes, nobody said a word. I looked over at Marigold once during that silence. She looked like someone walking into something she already knew was going to hurt, and choosing to walk in anyway. We pulled into the driveway and the porch light was on. Lyra opened the front door before we even got to the steps. Her face just crumbled. She said, "Please, please be gentle with him." Octavia didn't slow down. She walked right up and said, "Was he gentle with Luna?" Lyra flinched like she'd been hit. She stepped to the side and let us in. Braylon was sitting in the living room. He looked like he hadn't slept at all since I'd been there that morning. He saw the four of us walk in together and he stood up. He said, "Sit down, all of you." I said, "We'll stand." Marigold stepped forward. She was so calm it was almost hard to look at. She said, "I won't be long. I just have one question." Braylon looked at her, and Marigold said, "Did you know your cousin poisoned my mother?" Braylon's jaw tightened. He said, "I did not know that." Marigold said, "Did you know he visited her the night she died?" Braylon said, "Not at the time. I found out later." Marigold said, "How much later?" Braylon said, "A few years." The room went silent. I said, "You found out years later that your cousin visited a woman who died the same night and you never said anything?" Braylon's eyes moved to me. He said, "And say what? That my cousin might have killed someone? Based on what? A visitor log?" I had no proof. I had 4 daughters to protect. Cordelia spoke next, and her voice was shaking but clear. She said, "You had 3 daughters to protect. Marigold was the one who needed protecting from this." Braylon looked like he'd been slapped. He turned to Marigold and his voice dropped. "I raised you. I loved you. I gave you everything I gave them. You are my daughter." Marigold didn't look away. She said, "I had a mother. Her name was Luna. She was 20 years old and she was scared and someone killed her and you covered it up by raising me like nothing happened." Braylon broke. With something that looked like the weight of 29 years finally landing on him. He sat down and put his head in his hands and he said, "I didn't cover it up. I just didn't uncover it. There's a difference." I said, "No, Dad, there isn't." Lyra's voice came from the doorway behind us. She said, "I need to say something." Everyone turned. She was standing there with her arms wrapped around herself. "I told your father years ago that we needed to come forward, about the cousin, about how we got Marigold. He told me if I did, we'd lose all 4 of you, that they'd take Marigold away because the adoption was never legal. And I was a coward. I chose keeping my family over doing the right thing." She looked at Marigold. "I'm sorry. I have been sorry every single day." Marigold stood up. She walked over to Lyra slowly, and she said, "You could have told me when I was 18. You could have told me when I was 25. You waited until a DNA test forced your hand." Lyra nodded. Marigold said, "I need time. I love you, but I need time." Then she turned to me and Octavia and Cordelia and said, "Let's go." My sisters walked out first. I was the last one. I stopped at the door. I turned around and looked at Braylon and I said, "Marigold's grandmother has the visitor log and the autopsy report. She's been waiting 29 years to find out what happened to her daughter. She deserves to know everything. If you don't tell her, we will." He didn't look up. He just said, "I know." The 4 of us sat in the car in the driveway for a long time after that. Nobody started the engine. Marigold reached over from the passenger seat and took my hand. Her hand was cold. I held it tight. Then Octavia reached from the back seat and put her hand on Marigold's shoulder. Then Cordelia did the same. We sat like that for maybe 5 minutes. Marigold said, "I'm not a quadruplet. I never was." I squeezed her hand and said, "You're my sister. That part was never a lie." Marigold nodded slowly. "I know. That's the only reason I'm still here." I started the car and we drove to Sheba's house. It was late, but Marigold had called ahead. Sheba was waiting. Marigold walked in with everything Lyra had confessed. Sheba listened. Then she stood up and walked over to Marigold and held her face in both hands and said, "You look just like her." Marigold's voice was soft but steady. She said, "I want to know everything about her." Sheba nodded and said, "I've been waiting 29 years to tell someone." I watched from the doorway while Sheba and Marigold sat down together. I thought about how the worst part of being a quadruplet was never the matching outfits or the shared birthdays. The worst part was that someone always knew something the others didn't. And now finally, we all knew the same thing. The truth didn't make us closer, but it made us honest. For the first time in 29 years, that was enough. 3 weeks later, Sheba called me. Her voice was different, careful. She said she'd been going back through her old folder, the one she'd kept for 29 years. She said she found something at the very bottom she'd never noticed before. A second visitor name from the same night, signed in 2 hours after the cousin. The handwriting matched Lyra's.